Actually, maybe we should see. So much for being here.
Can everyone hear me okay? Is this good? All right.
There's a bell.
Great. Well, good evening. Thank you for having me. I guess for anyone watching, I'll just introduce briefly. I'm Alyssa Tibbetts, the town attorney from Jensen Baird, and I've been asked to speak to the council tonight about two topics, one of which is probably going to take the bulk of the workshop, and then a second that I'll cover briefly. The first is with respect to tax increment financing, just to do a sort of high-level overview of what that looks like under Maine law, but also how the town has utilized tax increment financing to date, and answer any questions that you may have after kind of just doing an overview. I've provided an outline, which is a very basic outline of what tax increment financing is under Maine law. This is not specific to the town of Cumberland. This is just what Maine law allows municipalities to do. And I will talk a little bit about, in the course of the workshop, what the town has done in particular. But this is just a basic outline with respect to what the law allows for municipalities. And then the second topic, which we'll cover sort of briefly, and I'll save to the end, is with respect to something called conduit financing. And that's something that the town has done previously and that Maine law also allows. And this is with respect specifically to the Friends School, who will be coming before the council probably sometime this fall with a request. There's an existing loan outstanding and they're looking to likely refinance or extend or modify that, and it will require some action on behalf of the town based on the structure of that financing. So I'll just give you a quick overview at the end of the meeting as to what that looks like so you can anticipate that when it's coming and answer any questions that you may have. So starting with the tax increment financing, I did not prepare a PowerPoint. This is a boring enough topic without a PowerPoint, so I'm going to do my best not to put you to sleep before you have a business meeting after this. And please feel free to interrupt me with any questions as we go along, or thoughts or anything that pops into your head. I'm happy to make this more interactive if we can. High level, I just want to kind of go over the basics. Some of you may already know these, and I'll try not to dive too far. If I go too quickly, feel free to stop me and we can cover something. Generally speaking, tax increment financing is what people refer to as TIFs, really has the three components that you hear in the name. Tax is related to property tax. Increment is related to value of the property tax and development that occurs. And financing relates to the revenue from that new value based on the property tax and what municipalities can do with that revenue under Maine law. So it is a tool that has largely been viewed as an economic development tool under Maine law that allows a municipality to designate what we call a district, which is a defined geographical area within the community, and you can have more than one, subject to some limits that we'll talk about, where the municipality expects to see an increase in assessed value. And under Maine law, the municipality can do what's called capture new value by designating a TIF district. So for instance, if you have, and this isn't the only scenario, but if you have a vacant piece of property that you have a development proposal for, a town can establish a TIF district on that property and capture all new value that is developed on that property. So there's a base value when you establish the TIF district, and all new value beyond that base is something that the town can capture up to 100%, but you can also do less. So it's really a municipal district, and it's a matter of policy to decide. Bob?
Is it a sliding scale, meaning as property evaluates each year, the value of that TIF increases each year, or is it fixed?
It is a sliding scale, so the base value when you designate the district initially never changes. That always stays the same as of the original designation date of the district. But the increase in the value continues to appreciate, presuming that the value continues to appreciate. In some circumstances, for instance, in a year where you have a reval, the property tax, the property value may change, but the tax rate will also likely change at that time. So your revenue impact could theoretically be a little bit different in that year. But under most circumstances, the increased assessed value of the property continues to go up year over year. And so what the town captures is everything over that original base amount, which stays fixed, so that the capture amount does continue to increase. Did you have a question, Mike? Okay. And so when you designate a district and you capture value, as I said, you can determine the percentage of the value that you capture. So a lot of municipalities will capture 100%, but you don't have to. You could decide that you want to capture 50% or 75%, depending on the circumstances. And that consideration typically depends on how you intend to use the revenue from that new captured value. So when you have new value in a TIF district that gets captured, the corresponding tax revenue on that new value is what we call TIF revenue. And it's sheltered. Yeah.
With the capturing value, you said we can designate how much we want to capture. Is that set in stone? Once we do it, it's the only way to change it would be to end the TIF district, and then create another one at a new baseline?
Nope, you don't have to. So it depends on how your district is set up, but many of the newer TIF districts in the town in particular, and for a lot of our clients, have language in them that authorize the legislative body, so in this case the council, to adjust that year to year. So within a fiscal year, if you're preparing a budget and you say we need to capture 100% or we don't want to capture 100%, the council can make that decision by just doing a formal vote. To adjust that from year to year throughout the life of the TIF district. If the document that authorizes the TIF district doesn't contain that language, it can be amended to do so. So you don't have to end the district and you don't have to create a new one, but ultimately it's just up to the legislative body of the town to make that adjustment annually. So in terms of the revenue from the taxes on the new value, because this was intended under state statute to be an economic development tool, the use of the TIF revenue is limited. And so most of the categories that you'll see, and I think about this in kind of three buckets. Maine law allows municipalities to spend TIF revenue on projects within the district, and there's certain prescribed costs, so these are sort of high-level summaries. Outside of the district, but directly related to or made necessary by activities in the district. So there's some nexus there between development activity in your TIF district and the use of TIF revenue. And then the third category is other economic development costs. And this category has sort of expanded over the years, even recently. The categories now include affordable housing, which is relatively new. That's been expanding over the past couple of years. Environmental improvements, costs of education programs and training programs, most recently, costs of central administrative offices for municipalities, like a town hall. There are limits on that in terms of the percentage of captured assessed value that you can use. But previously, the TIF statute had just sort of an express outright prohibition on the use of TIF revenue for government purposes. And that's becoming, that's slowly being authorized by the legislature in certain areas throughout the statute, so that the uses of TIF revenue are expanding or have expanded in recent years to include those types of costs. And then there are some more specific sort of, general development within the municipality types of uses of TIF revenue.
Go for it.
Let's just say you have an income of $1 million a year from a TIF district, and can you take that money and float a bond, put a bond out, because we want to accomplish a task, if you will, and use that TIF money to pay the bond?
You can, with two caveats. One is the bond has to fund something that's otherwise an eligible TIF cost
Right.
under the statute.
Right.
And two, you're using the TIF revenue to pay the debt service on the bond, and that can't exceed the life of the TIF district, with the exception of a recent change in the legislation is that you can go up to 3 years past the expiration of your TIF district to continue paying debt service.
I'll give you an example. Let's just say that I wanted to combine a train station down on Stiles Way and an affordable housing project, and I've engaged a contractor / builder, and he says, I need all my money within 3 years. We don't have the money, but we could finance it, bond it over 20 years. Is that?
You can, yes. Yep, so you can use the projected TIF revenue from development to finance or pay for debt service over long term when you issue a bond or any other kind of borrowing. And then just generally speaking, in terms of the eligible uses of TIF revenue, what I've outlined is what the statute allows. That's sort of your umbrella. When you adopt or designate a TIF district as a municipality, you also have to identify how you intend to use the TIF revenue. So it's a two-pronged approach in terms of the authorization of what you can spend TIF revenue on. What the statute allows, and then within that, what you as a municipality have said you intend to use. So even if the statute says I can spend TIF revenue on certain projects as a municipality, if I haven't identified that in the municipal development program, the town can't use TIF revenue for that. You can amend a district at any time during the term of the district to include those costs, and many municipalities do, especially when the legislature adds to authorized uses of project costs. But that's a really key point for municipalities. Just because the statute says this is authorized, if you haven't identified it, then it's something that you would need to do before you spend TIF revenue on those types of projects.
So when you say municipal plan, are you talking about the comp plan or a different type of document?
A different document. So
Okay.
the way that a TIF district gets designated and approved is that the municipality, and this is sort of outlined generally in the handout that I provided, the municipality identifies the property. It can be any property. It doesn't have to be contiguous. It can be multiple properties. It could be scattered throughout the town, or it can be a bunch of adjacent area. They are limited by acreage and value, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But otherwise, it's really up to you to determine where you want to designate a district. Once you've done that, the statutory requirements are that you hold a public hearing on your proposed program, the area of the district, how you intend to use the TIF revenue, and sort of the elements of what you would, how the TIF district would be operated. And there is a document that really governs a TIF district, which we call the development program. So that gets drafted typically before you have a public hearing on these so that it can be available to the public and people can take a look at it and understand what the town wants to do with the TIF district. That document tells tell the reader or anybody where the district is, what the acreage is, what the expected new value is, how the TIF revenue will be used. And so all of the elements of the district are governed by that document going forward. After the public hearing, that then gets submitted to the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development. And their role is, again, these are municipal programs, but their role is to ensure that the municipal program that got adopted is consistent with state law. So they review the program to ensure that everything that's in there is authorized by law, that what you've decided to do with your TIF district is not outside the bounds of what the statute says you can do. And then that gets reviewed by DEC, the Office of DECD, the Commissioner of DECD, in some cases, some other agencies, depending on the type of TIF district, and you receive an approval letter from DECD, and that's the effective date of your district. So that's sort of the process. And when I refer to the plan, that's really what I mean, is that development program that got created in the context of approving a TIF district locally.
Okay, and one other just follow-up question. So we have 8 TIF districts currently, right? So is it down to acreage? What is it, 5%?
Yeah, so I, and I apologize, I didn't make copies of this, but I did a really quick kind of overview for myself coming into tonight to look at the town's TIF districts. So you, of the 8 districts that you have, the first was established in 1997. That's been amended a few times. It extends for the full 30 years. All of the town's TIF districts currently are at the full 30 years, which is the maximum under Maine law, with a relatively recent caveat, which I'll talk about. But currently, the town's 8 TIF districts are all for 30-year terms. They range in terms of start dates from 1997 was TIF 1 to 2018 was TIF 8, and then they all extend for a 30-year period. At this point, I think all but one is at 100%, or maybe TIF 1 may still be at 50%, but TIF 8 being the most recent was established at 50% unless the council determines that you'd like to capture 100% in any given year, but you have the flexibility to make that determination on an annual basis. And so from a geographical perspective, to your question about acreage, the town's current TIF districts total 670 acres. And as a percentage of the town's total acreage, which is 14,848. The town's current percentage of TIF district acreage is 4.51. So the threshold, as you said, is 5% total. And that would be the maximum under Maine law for any number of TIF districts that a municipality has at any one time. It can't exceed 5% of your total acreage.
So, and the remaining balance would be what?
4.5, 0.49.
0.49, which would equate to what acreage?
Oh. Mr. Sturgis.
All right, I'm getting out my calculator. I have a handy one at home.
Yeah, I mean, it's right, so a half a percent.
There's a real quick question.
Sorry.
Can we, with the TIF funds, can we purchase a piece of land in anticipation? So it comes up for sale, and we're not quite ready to do a project, but we want to do something with it. Can we purchase that land and hold it for a while, or do we
So-
have to have a?
Yeah, it's possible, but I would say it's a little bit more limited in terms of how you do that, because you would need to determine, is the land going to be in a TIF district, because that's a category of expenditure, and if so, we need to make sure it meets the requirements. So capital costs and land acquisition are authorized within a TIF district. If it's not already in a TIF district, we have to determine at that time, are we going to put it in a TIF district? And if so, if it's not in a TIF district, you don't really have TIF revenue other than from other districts to expend on it. So you'd have to look at, do existing districts have revenue that we could spend outside of a district? And if so, is it an eligible cost in terms of the intended use of the property or where it's going to fall? So the answer is not no, but it's a bit more complicated in terms of having the revenue to use from a TIF district to spend money on something that's land that's not already in a
Thank you.
TIF district. Excuse me. The other thing I wanted to add in terms of acreage, there's an additional cap under the statute with respect to TIF districts total, and that relates to value. So the base value of a district is what's referred to as the original assessed value, or OAV. And under the statute, similar to the acreage cap, the original assessed value of all districts in the municipality also can't exceed 5%, and there's an individual district max as well. The town's cap here is well below the 5%. It's 0.95%, so it's less than 1% at this point. So that's not a concern, but in terms of acreage, the town is getting closer to the limit with its 8 TIF districts currently.
Do you mind repeating that one more time? I just want to make sure I'm following.
Sure.
So, go ahead.
So the original value of a TIF district, which is the assessed value at the time of the property in the district at the time that it is created. So this is,
So like a basis value?
yes, your
Okay.
basis value before any new development occurs. That's what's known as the OAV, or the original assessed value.
Tracking.
And that original assessed value is subject to a limit under Maine law, so that the combined total of all of your TIF districts, the original assessed value of all of your TIF districts, can't exceed 5% of the town's total valuation.
Got it.
So,
So, sorry, one other sidebar question. So if the town's valuation increases this year, does that change anything for us?
Yep, it changes the, the ratio or the margin in terms of what your percentage is. So your original assessed value of the districts never changes, but your total taxable municipal valuation increases. So
Okay.
the percentage gets smaller
Okay,
of what you have in terms of current TIF districts.
okay.
most everything starts off as raw land. There's very few things that we do or have or obtain that don't start off as raw land. And for instance, Ocean View's estate across the street was raw land, so that was the original assessed value, just raw land. That's the benchmark.
That's right. And it's based on the tax year in which you create the district. So for instance, if you were creating a TIF district right now, which you can do, the way that the valuation is handled in terms of setting the base and then new value from there, as of August 12th, right now, the base value of a new district would be as of March 31st of this year, which is actually, so March 31st of '24, which is actually April 1 of 2023's valuation, because that was the last tax year. So that's your base for a TIF district. It's the March 31st of the most recent March 31st. And then from there, all new value on top of that is what gets captured at whatever percentage you designate.
So are we using states, what's an acronym there? States assessed, balanced, and we're not using the local assessment, we're using the state's assessment.
The state equalized assessment?
Yes.
Yes. So it takes, it takes a year or two to sort of catch up, because what you do is file your municipal valuation return, and you identify what property is being captured, you determine what your valuation is. In terms of the percentage, we're using the state equalized valuation from the most recent April 1st to do that calculation of the 5%. Any other
I
questions?
have a really dumb question.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. All right, so if we were to say purchase 3 acres of like an apple orchard, right? That's agricultural land. So that's going to have a lower assessed value, and then ultimately, depending on what goes there, right?
Right.
A much larger, not that I think that we should be buying apple orchards, but just curious about like, the differentiation of like different types of land,
Sure.
right?
So it's a consideration. I mean, when you create a TIF district, it doesn't have to be raw land, it doesn't have to be vacant land, it could be developed.
Yeah.
The key is that you expect that there will be some increment, meaning whatever your base value is when you start the district, whether it's raw land or it was, used for something that's like agriculture, and you expect that it's going to be used for something with a much higher value, you know that you'll have an increment there. So typically when we evaluate these, we look at what's the development proposal or potential over this time period. And a couple of the considerations in determining both whether to have a TIF district and when to establish one are because you're limited in terms of 30 years, in many cases it doesn't make sense to just establish them and let them sit there without development potential, because the clock starts running and it's the maximum under the statute. And then, in other circumstances, it doesn't make sense when you've got a property that's already developed and it's got a pretty high value, and even upon redevelopment, there's not enough of an increment or new value for that to really make sense. Sometimes there is. I mean, for instance, let's see, an example, TIF District 3, which is the town's Cumberland Foreside Village. The original assessed value of that was $3.7 million. There was already development there, but the expectation was the new development will be significantly more in terms of value, so it doesn't matter that it's raw land because there's enough increment there to capture that it will, it's beneficial to the town to have the ability to use that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a low-value land or, vacant land or town-owned land in order for it to make sense. You just have to know that there's an increment potential.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
So we currently have 8, and we have the acreage is sort of the limiting factor
Yeah.
right now.
Right.
And let's say hypothetically where there's an area where we want to develop and we think it would be great, but the acreage is too much. Can we shut down TIFs early?
Yep.
Just to sort of play around and say, all right, well, we think this one has sort of run its course. We're going to shut this one down and still got 25 years left or
Yes.
5 years left or anything like that.
You can either terminate a district entirely, or you can amend a district to remove property from it and make it smaller. So, if you find that TIF District 4, which is 98 acres, if you find that that just hasn't really performed, there hasn't been a benefit to capturing all of the property that's in that district, but 1 or 2 properties were developed and you've got some increment and that's working well, the town can amend those districts and shrink the size to remove the acreage. And that frees up acreage for other districts where it may be, more beneficial to have TIF districts.
What would happen to the businesses, their credit enhancement agreements?
So-
If we were to, that wouldn't be very nice.
Yeah, so every TIF district, or a decision in every TIF district is whether to offer a credit enhancement agreement. It's specific to a business. Depending on how it's written, it either runs with a property or it's independent, specific to the owner of the business, up to the town in terms of how that gets negotiated. But the district is much larger than the credit enhancement agreement. So the credit enhancement agreement can't operate without the district. And so to the extent that you had a property that had a credit enhancement agreement, you wouldn't want to remove that property from the district. But you likely, in the case of the town's TIF districts, you have in most of these districts, many other properties that are not subject to a credit enhancement agreement that are also in the district. So those are properties that could be removed. If there's not a lot of value there, there's no benefit to that property owner under the credit enhancement agreement, no use of TIF revenue for that, and it's not really performing in terms of new value, you can remove those properties.
Thanks.
All right, let me see. What else I wanted to talk about?
Oh, could you talk about the extension?
Well, actually, that was just what I was thinking, so thank you. Yeah, one of the recent changes, I touched briefly on some legislative changes in terms of the uses of TIF revenue, one of which is the use of TIF revenue for central administrative offices, which is new. Another recent change that the legislature adopted is the ability to, so as I said, a TIF district historically has been limited to 30 years maximum term under Maine law. And while you can amend districts and do things with them, if you designated it for 20 years, you can extend it to 30, but you've never been able to extend it past 30. That was the end of the district. And at that point, you could start a new one, but your base value starts over. So there's usually not a good reason to do that. Within the last 2 years, the legislature has adopted an amendment to the TIF statute that allows municipalities to extend a TIF district beyond the 30-year period within a certain time period of that legislation, I think it's 15 years, provided that you're using the TIF revenue, at least 75% of the TIF revenue, for either affordable housing or transit-oriented development. So what this looks like is you can have an existing TIF districts may not necessarily have been established for affordable housing or transit, and you have the ability to extend it, provided that you're dedicating at least 75% of the TIF revenue to those uses. So, there's several clients we're working with who are looking at these things right now. I've worked with the ECD closely in terms of how this is going to operate. Mechanically, from a review perspective, nobody has actually adopted an extension or had one approved because the legislation is still so new. But most of the municipalities, and in talking with DECD, are looking at this within a year or two of the expiration of a district. There's sort of an open question around whether it can be done sooner that we've been talking through, and I don't yet know whether DECD will view it that way. But looking at districts that are coming to an end, if the municipality, the town says, we think that there is value in a particular district that's performing well that we could apply at least 75% to either of these uses, then you have the ability to extend it. And you would do that the same way you would adopt an original district. So it's the same process in terms of creating the development program document and having a public hearing.
So the older a district is, the more value it has if you discount inflation, cost of expenses and things like that. If you started with a piece of raw land and said it was assessed value of $500,000 and now there's a whole community of commercial buildings on top of it or something that has a value, the longer it goes from that starting date 25 years ago today, more value it has, right?
That's right. And the primary benefit of being able to extend a district is that you get to keep that base value. So you've built up all this new value over a 20 or 30-year period, and if you choose to extend it for either of these purposes, you keep your base value from 20 or 30 years ago. It doesn't reset at that point.
So,
Go ahead.
then Denise, or just real quick on it. So TIF 1 expires in 2028, right? So if we, just in terms of the document, if we wanted, and we're also going into the comprehensive plan. So if we wanted the folks who are doing the research, kind of having the meetings for the comprehensive plan to have the option of thinking about the extension of that district, like a tool in their tool belt, right, as they kind of go about that process, do we have to have done kind of that pre-work of saying, like, all right, here's our document, this is the intended use, like, but then, because what I'm kind of getting at is, does it make sense to do it when we don't know what they're gonna be doing, or we don't know what the output of the comprehensive plan is gonna be, right? And so, to what extent are you, like, you're not,
Guiding them.
like, you're guiding them, but also committing, like, you're not committing to doing anything with that, are you? Is it more of like an MOU type of situation? Am I making sense?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
It's like you don't want to tamper with their outcome, right? So it's like, how can you keep it unbiased for them to be able to make decisions, but no, that's an option, and we're not committing to extending it in that scenario also.
And what paperwork would we need to do ahead of time?
You don't have to do any,
Okay.
which I think, in large part addresses your concern. So the municipality doesn't have to adopt or create the development program and have the public hearing until you have, I would say, at least a framework for what you'd like the district to be.
Okay.
So to my mind, the sequence of what you're describing would be what the statute allows is really sort of the guardrails or the parameters that you can provide to the committee who's working on the comp plan or any other group who's looking at this. With, a question, I guess, a frame posed to them of, this is what we can do under the statute. Does it make sense for us to do this within the context of this overall planning document? And if the recommendation of the committee is yes, then you would prepare the documentation, have a public hearing, and move forward with the district. From a timing perspective, with a district that's expiring in 2028, that works okay. Just keeping in mind that decision has to be made before the district ends, or you lose the opportunity. But thinking about it now and planning for it now and, kind of giving a charge to a committee to think about that as an option is certainly appropriate, and you wouldn't have to go through the full process to get it approved. It's just a recommendation for you to decide whether to take the action after that.
Thanks. Denise?
My question is much more simple. You said that the extension is 15 years, is that right? Okay, thanks.
Well, it's up to 20 years, but it's within and I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. It's within a 10 or 15-year time period of when this legislation got adopted.
Okay.
You have the option to do this. The extension is for up to 20 years.
Okay, thank you.
Just check time. So if there aren't other questions, I might talk about Friends School, just so I don't lose that window, and then we can certainly come back to this if there's time, but if anyone has any other questions on TIF districts, I'm happy to cover them.
We'll do 2 hours next time on TIF.
Well, I said to Matt, I'm sure we could spend a long time on this, but it's probably best done in pieces. With respect to conduit financing, as I mentioned earlier, Maine law allows a municipality or the state, the Finance Authority of Maine, to issue what are called revenue refunding securities. Or revenue securities. These are bonds that a governmental organization issues, but they are not obligated to pay the debt service on those bonds, which is why we refer to them as conduit financing. So you serve as the body who has the authority under the law to actually issue a bond. And, you know, not every entity can do that. You are a government organization, and for tax purposes, that's something that you can uniquely do that a nonprofit organization or others can't do. And it allows an organization that qualifies under the tax code to get the benefit of tax-exempt financing, which is a much lower borrowing rate, to finance a qualifying project under the code. So Maine law authorizes this, and the town has already done this for the Friends School. So it was, I think, 2015, the town issued revenue bonds under Maine law. It was 2.3 million that were used by the Friends School to build the campus. Those bonds are coming due soon. They would like to refund them and extend them. I don't yet have the details of that, so that's why the council's not acting on it tonight, because we'll wait and see what the structure looks like. But if and when they do that, and the expectation is that they will want to do that, the council will be required to act as it was in 2015 to adopt a resolution under the authorizing statute under Maine law that allows this borrowing to occur, to make a number of findings in terms of your authority under the law to do this. The bonds are required to state on their face that it is not an obligation of the town, that the town is not borrowing the money and the town is not paying the debt service on the money. But the mechanism that allows this to happen under both Maine law and the Internal Revenue Code requires that the town take these actions and that the town hold a hearing before taking these actions. So there will be a couple of steps required of the council when we receive this request, and we thought it would be helpful to just kind of give you, a general understanding of what would be coming before you. There will be a couple of steps in terms of a hearing, a resolution that the council will have to adopt, and then there's what's called a notice of intent to issue under the statute that we publish related following your hearing.
What happens if we don't?
That's a conversation we'd have to have with them at this point. Their bonds are coming due, TD Bank purchased the bonds and has is essentially their lender under this scenario, and they're obligated to pay that back. Whether they can or not will be up to them. Ultimately, I don't know what the restructuring is that they're looking to do, but if the town doesn't agree to do that, they will have to determine how they're going to, satisfy their obligations under their loan agreement.
Mike jumped the gun on me. One of the options is to call the note.
Yes. So they have a loan agreement with TD Bank, and it would be subject to whatever the terms are in their loan agreement in terms of the maturity at this point.
Not to play good cop, bad cop, but we might say, tried some negotiating with them, say, geez, how about a daycare center? Why don't you open a daycare center, and we'll happily sign the.
A subsidized daycare center.
Don't give away the store.
Bob, I was here when we agreed to do that. And what happened, after we agreed to it, we did it in good faith. The Friends School then applied to DOT to put that
Yes.
as a school zone. Even though nobody walks, it's way back, and now all of a sudden you've got a traffic issue.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yep, we addressed that with the Friends School, told them we would rather not have a school zone there, and they threatened to take us to court. So that's the kind of thank you that we got from the Friends School. What happens when you're around for a while, you kind of remember these things.
Yes, well, that's glad you brought that up.
So the way you're explaining it, it's not like you're co-signing an auto loan for your child and you're on the hook. So what is I understand that they wouldn't otherwise qualify, but what is in it for the town to continue this is my question.
Yeah,
Just to be nice, or
I would say to the extent, trying to answer your question diplomatically, because it's not my opinion, of course, it's just to the extent that you as a council feel that there is a benefit to having the project in the town, then it allows them to continue to access financing that makes it financially viable for them. That's it's not the only option. I wouldn't suggest that they can't continue to exist without that. I don't know anything about their finances or, what they're looking to finance here, but typically that's the consideration. We as a government entity have the ability to issue bonds. Many private developments, in terms of that qualify under the tax regulations for sort of private, what we call private activity, frequently seek this type of financing as a first resort because obviously it's more favorable in terms of interest rates. So it's not uncommon by any means, but typically the consideration is it's a project that we want in the community, and so we're willing to support it for that reason.
So when it comes back around again, is there going to be kind of a plan they've outlined as far as this is what we paid, this is what remains, this is our plan to eventually complete our obligation, to show that there's some sort of progress happening there before we make that choice?
So that's our ask to them at this point. This was on the agenda for this evening, and we didn't have that information. So, it's been pushed at this point so that when you are asked to have a hearing on this and vote on it, you will have the details with respect to what is in fact being refinanced. For instance, I don't know if it's just the balance of what's due at this point, or if they're looking to increase that amount for any other projects. I don't have any of that information. But my expectation of them would be that we will have that information for you before this is on a council agenda.
Okay, thank you.
You, and then you. 'Cause you had your hand up first.
Yeah. Is it out of scope for us to have any question? I mean, I know you said they're going to present their finances, but should that be of concern for us?
Not really, to be honest with you, because
Okay.
the town, this is not an obligation of the town. So, whether they're in default or not is
Yeah.
not, it has no bearing on the town's credit or the town's borrowing ability or the town's requirement to pay anything.
Okay.
It would really be up to them as to how much they're willing to share. You can certainly ask as part of your due diligence in terms of authorizing this, but because you are not obligated for the debt in any way,
Yeah.
they certainly could say, well, we'll have to make a decision whether we think that this is information we want to share and it's worthwhile to us, or if we feel like this is not information we want to share and we want to seek other avenues.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're not on the hook for anything. It doesn't ding our credit if they default or anything. Taking this specific example out and sort of, pulling back a little bit, what's the downside for the town for these bonds, issuing these bonds?
There isn't any from a debt perspective or from any other perspective. This happens at the local level, it happens at the state level, and there are authorities within the country who do this throughout the country. Like, for instance, in Wisconsin, there's a public finance authority similar to Maine that issues bonds, these types of conduit bonds for developers throughout the country. So it's a really common practice. It's just the mechanism to authorize the issuance of tax-exempt bonds for qualified projects, because individual corporations can't go out and do that. But it's very secure in terms of what the statute says and what the requirements are under the law in Maine and both federally in terms of your obligations as a community.
So really, it's all upside if we like the potential borrower and,
Sure.
and no downside?
That's right. I mean, most of the time, the situation is that it's more of it's not always a partnership, but it's just a community project that you're interested in supporting. There are other avenues if they don't have support from the town that they could seek, and they may be able to issue bonds in the same way. It's certainly easier to go to your local project jurisdiction. That's kind of the lowest level and typically the most ideal to get the authority, but the authority is required under both the federal tax code and under state law for the local jurisdiction, or a local jurisdiction, whether it's the state or the town, to take these particular actions before the bonds can be issued.
Are they tax exempt?
That's what I just asked Bob, yeah.
Interesting.
Interesting. Bob. What is Bob?
Can we go back to TIF for just a second?
Sure.
So we're at 4.5% of our acreage.
Yes.
Does it make sense at some point for us to sit down and look at our existing districts and look at the acreage there and the valuation for there and say, we may want to let these expire in the anticipation of maybe we'll have a different TIF coming forward or different opportunity coming forward?
I think that's a good exercise generally, to be honest, just in terms of managing TIF districts, both thinking about acreage that's contained in the district, because, you know, a 20-year look forward and look back can be very different in terms of the expectations of the development of property and the performance of property. So what the town may have thought 20 years ago or 15 years ago was going to be a high or a peak development area may still really not be providing much increment today. And if the expectations haven't really changed, that's a prime opportunity, I think, to kind of right-size a district or remove property or think about other properties that could be added. You could do that with all of the districts at once. You know, you could really look at the property in each one. You could frankly amend them all. I mean, I'm not suggesting you undertake that all at one time, but you can do that at any time. And then if you determine that there are other opportunities that you'd like to include in TIF districts, you can either kind of just identify those and figure out the right time to establish a new district, or that's something that you could do now.
Do you, maybe you're not allowed to answer this, but Yarmouth, I think, did something really cool. Ooh, do you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes, could we talk about what Yarmouth did with their, it's like an LLC, basically, right? Kind of within their...
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll talk
Economic development.
Yeah, I'll talk generally, but because there are other communities who have done it too. So there are a couple of communities in Maine who have economic development corporations, and a number of them either administer and manage the TIF districts and/or are funded through TIF districts. And I mean, I don't know that I want to say it's common, but it's not uncommon in the state. I mean, there are a number of economic development corporations. I think they vary in terms of how active they are and how engaged. Funding is obviously a big consideration, but there are communities like Wyndham has a very active one. Gorham has an economic development corporation, maybe not quite as active as Wyndham. But, you know, those are, in communities like that and some of those corporations, some of them have staff. Many of them are who are really kind of in charge of the economic development activities within the community, and who provide guidance with respect to TIF districts, help manage them, help oversee them, help suggest when they should be implemented. So that's certainly something that you could look at. I mean, and then the alternative to that, which other municipalities do, is they have a municipal employee who is really in that role. And you know, I don't think there are significant advantages and disadvantages. One of the things I will say is a difference between an economic development corporation doing that and a municipality. A lot of the economic development corporations have revolving loan funds, and they are more actively engaged in managing those and providing opportunities to local businesses, which is harder to do on the municipal side or as a staff member on the municipal side.
Interesting.
So those are some examples, but yes, you can certainly fund operations and or staff of those types of organizations with TIF districts.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Denise.
So
go
I don't know
for
if
it.
I
Just
can
go for it.
recognize
Sorry,
you
sorry.
or the chair has to.
So question on the conduit financing. First, is Friends the only one we've done that with? And second, I'm thinking of, you know, Bob mentioned daycares, things like that, things that the community wants, but there may be someone, even locally, who wants to start that business but can't. If it's something that the people in town want, is that something that towns use as a way to kind of get that going? Is that used often in that way? Have we done that before with anyone else?
Typically not with bonds. You have to qualify as a type of organization, and you have to have a qualifying activity under the code to be able to access tax-exempt financing through bonds that the town could issue. So that's a pretty unique subset of borrowers who would come to the town looking for a bond to be issued and to borrow through that. But from a startup or a business loan perspective, what we were just talking about actually is a good example of that in a way that communities do that through revolving loan funds or grants that are funded through TIF districts. So that is relatively common, especially with TIF districts. The borrowing piece of it in terms of they're different though, I guess is what I would say. You know, the borrowing piece in terms of the town issuing bonds is much more limited in terms of who would have access to that or the ability to access that. But you could certainly look at business development opportunities through the use of things like TIF districts.
Thank you.
Unless there are any other questions, maybe we'll take a quick bio break before we start at 7. Alyssa, are there any other questions?
I've got all mine answered.
Okay. Alyssa, thank you so much. This was lovely,
Absolutely.
wildly informative. And we'll see you soon, I'm
Nice to
sure.
see you all.
Probably sooner than you would like.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa.